The reality is that this censorship regime and this attack on due process, this forced closing of media outlets, and the requirement that certain conservative media outlets fire certain people, their most popular, genuinely right-wing hosts, is something that has been happening since 2019 while Bolsonaro was still president. So this predates Lula, this attack on basic free speech, because it's coming from the Supreme Court and from one judge in particular named Alexandre de Moraes. In 2016, Lula's successor, from this left-wing party, Dilma Rousseff, she won in 2014 in a close election. The center-right never really accepted her victory in 2014, and so in 2016, they succeeded in impeaching her. They removed her from office 2 years before her term ended, and they replaced her with her vice president, named Michel Temer. And the Brazilian left despised Michel Temer, thought he was guilty of a coup, and he joined forces with the center-right in trying to implement austerity. And it was Michel Temer who first appointed Alexandre de Moraes as his justice minister, and then as his justice minister put him on the Supreme Court. The left was opposed to Alexandre de Moraes. They called him a racist and a fascist, even though they now love Alexandre de Moraes. He's like a hero to the left. It wasn't the left that put him on the Supreme Court. His power became so extreme that even the New York Times twice expressed concern about it before the election. And imagine how much it takes for the New York Times to express concern about a censorship regime and other attacks on due process and free speech being implemented by a judge against a right-wing political movement, which is the Bolsonaro movement, and in defense of a more left-wing government, which is Lula da Silva. You know the New York Times wanted Lula to win, but they were still extremely concerned by what this judge was doing. Here, for example, in September of 2022, so just 2 months or so before or a month before the Brazilian election, here is the New York Times, and there's a picture of Alexandre de Moraes. The headline was, "To defend democracy, is Brazil's top court going too far?" Brazil's Supreme Court has acted as the primary check on President Jair Bolsonaro's power. Now many are worried the court is posing its own threat. That's exactly what's happening in the United States. Even if you want to consider the Trump movement a threat, the confederation of power that has emerged in the name of stopping Trump and his movement has become far more authoritarian and threatening than anything they claim Trump is. Precisely because of that mentality I was describing earlier, that if you become so self-righteous in your political views that you are fighting some serious threat, you begin to believe that you are justified in any sort of authoritarian or even tyrannical methods because your cause is so just. That's the kind of mentality this engenders. And almost all of the Brazilian left, with a few exceptions, have stood by and cheered all of this. Something that was so extreme that even the New York Times decided to warn about. Quote, "Mr. Moraes has jailed 5 people without a trial for posts on social media that he said attacked Brazilian institutions." Let me just read that again. Mr. Moraes, that's the Supreme Court judge in Brazil, has jailed 5 people without a trial for posts on social media that he has said has attacked Brazil's institutions. This is in 2022, before Lula was elected. He has also ordered social networks to remove thousands of posts and video with little room for appeal. In many cases, Mr. Moraes has acted unilaterally, emboldened by new powers the court granted itself in 2019. This regime that is so threatening began in 2019, 3 years before Lula was elected. And these new powers the court granted itself in 2019 allow it to, in effect, act as an investigator, prosecutor, and judge all at once in some cases. And I would go so far as to even say that it's not just the court is acting as investigator, prosecutor, and judge, although it does that. It starts its own investigation. It prosecutes the person, it convicts them, it issues punishments with no due process and no explanation of any kind. But in many cases, this judge, Alexandre de Moraes, also considers himself the victim. So if somebody makes a video critical of him or a post critical of him, he will also sit in judgment of it. So he's not only the judge, jury, and executioner, but also the victim sitting in his own case. I mean, it's a violation of the most basic safeguards against judicial tyranny, which again, even the New York Times decided were so extreme that flags needed to be raised about it. Political leaders, said the New York Times, on the left and much of the Brazilian press and public have largely supported Mr. Moraes' actions as necessary measures to counter the singular threat posed by Bolsonaro. So this should sound familiar to everybody in the United States, that they support this tyranny because there's a singular threat posed by Bolsonaro. That's exactly the mentality that leads to authoritarianism in the United States. Oh, well, we're fighting a singular threat in Donald Trump. We can't afford these niceties of civil liberties and free speech. That is the mentality that is always the most dangerous. It's a mentality of such extreme self-righteousness that it recognizes no limits on its own power. Quote, but many legal experts say that Mr. Moraes' shows of force under the banner of saving democracy are themselves threatening to push the country toward an anti-democratic slide. I just want to make clear that the picture is more complicated than, oh, censorship happened because Lula got elected and people started getting put into prison. It's really coming from the Brazilian Supreme Court, and it happened before Lula was elected. The reality is that this censorship regime and this attack on due process, this forced closing of media outlets, and the requirement that certain conservative media outlets fire certain people, their most popular, genuinely right-wing hosts, is something that has been happening since 2019 while Bolsonaro was still president. 3 years before Lula was inaugurated. Lula won the election in 2022. He became president on January 1st, 2023. So this predates Lula, this attack on basic free speech, because it's coming from the Supreme Court and from one judge in particular named Alexandre de Moraes. They have basically succeeded in criminalizing the entire Bolsonaro movement. And I'd like to remind people, here is, for example, a headline from The Hill in July of 2019, Brazil president threatens to jail journalist Glenn Greenwald. And the Brazilian president at the time was Jair Bolsonaro, and that's exactly what he did. He held a press conference talking about reporting I was doing about his government. And he said, Glenn Greenwald says how much he loves Brazil and how much he loves seeing all parts of the country. Well, there's a good chance he's going to get to see our jail system, our prison system from the inside. And then 6 months later, I was actually indicted, not really because of Jair Bolsonaro, but because of his justice ministry and the justice minister on whom we were reporting, and allies of that justice minister inside the equivalent of the Justice Department. They charged me with being a conspirator, co-conspirator with my sources, and it got dismissed after about 3 weeks because of a Supreme Court ruling that protected my press freedom. But you can see, if a president of a country threatens to imprison me because of my journalism, you can safely assume I'm not a fan of that person. But I'm speaking as a believer in core political rights, the right of free speech, the right of a free press, the right of due process, all of which is being severely assaulted by the Supreme Court.